Okay, I'm back again, and we are going to read about King George V under the chapter of Constitutional Monarchy, which is chapter 5. It has a significant section here on Irish Home Rule, which was very important during his reign. It was when Ireland started to really have a desire for home rule. It was a movement that began, and we've seen it where some of the Irish soldiers would go off and fight in wars, especially during World War I. And then after they ended up getting segregated or partitioned, Ireland still today is separated between Northern Ireland and Southern Ireland. A beautiful country, wonderful people. There's this whole history of Ireland with the Troubles, but it does have a border where Northern Ireland is still part of the UK. So I've been to both. I've been to Northern Ireland and Dublin, and over here is Sligo. That's where Lord Mountbatten owned some property and a little castle or home, and he would do his fishing, and then he was assassinated by the IRA. But over here is some Galway is a very beautiful area. Kilcarney, Waterford. Over here near Waterford is where John F. Kennedy is from. But it's just a very beautiful. This Wicklow is another beautiful area if you ever want to go there. I've been there. But this Irish home rule is so important, and it was all occurring during something that George V had to deal with, as Ireland was wanting to become separate and have some independence, or at least some governing input into their country, and you can't really blame them. So I will get started and start reading. The king was glad to be back in London again. Went for a solitary walk in the garden, he wrote in his diary, with my umbrella and a companion. The passing of the Parliament Bill had enabled him to tour India free from political anxiety. But the respite was short-lived. From the spring of 1912 until the outbreak of war, more than 2 years later, he had been embroiled in the constitutional problems of home rule for Ireland. The Parliament Bill, it will be recalled, was designed to protect the program of liberal government from a hereditary hostility of the House of Lords. It ensured that the peers could neither amend nor reject any money measure approved by the Commons, and that their power to delay all other legislation should be limited to 2 years. The Liberals had won their victory only with the support of John Redmond and his fellow Irish members. In April 1912, the government prepared to repay its debt by introducing a bill for Irish home rule. It was not a bold or radical measure. The powers of the proposed Irish Parliament in Dublin resembled those of a county council rather than a national legislature. Taxation, defense, foreign policy, external trade, even the design of postage stamps would all remain in the responsibility of the British government and the Imperial Parliament. The Home Rule Bill, nevertheless, aroused some deep emotions on both sides of the Irish Sea. The proposal The prospect of a National Assembly dominated by Roman Catholics evoked a fierce response from the Protestants of Ulster, whose threat to establish an independent administration in Belfast won general sympathy from the Unionists at Westminster. The likelihood of a civil war seemed scarcely to perturb Mr. Asquith and his colleagues, brushing aside all suggestions that the Protestant counties be excluded from the operation of the Home Rule Bill. They completed its progress through the Commons on 16 January 1913. 2 weeks later, the measure was rejected by the Lords. That defeat did nothing to lessen the government's determination. The Prime Minister came, the King wrote in his diary on 7 February. He seemed very optimistic about everything as usual. Under the terms of the Parliament Act, the Home Rule Bill need only be introduced and approved by the Commons in 2 more successive sections for it to elude the reach of a hostile upper house. By the summer of 1914, the Liberals exulted it would be presented to the King for the formality of royal assent. Yet there were those who maintained the royal assent was no mere formality, that the sovereign's power of veto, although dormant for the past 2 centuries, could be revived at will, and that King George V should withhold his endorsement for so contentious a measure as the Home Rule Bill until the government had submitted it to the test of a general election. To justify that abrupt change of constitutional practice, its advocates invoked an ingenious argument. They pleaded that the Parliament Act of 1911, by failing to fulfill one of its declared purposes, had created a constitutional void which only the sovereign could fulfill. The preamble to that measure had declared that it is intended to substitute for the House of Lords, as it presently exists, a second chamber constituted on a popular instead of a hereditary basis. Once the bill had been enacted, however, the government found it convenient to forget that promise. In radical eyes, an unwieldy, hereditary, and much abused second chamber with limited powers was preferable to a compact, elected, and respected second chamber whose virtues were entitled to its powers scarcely inferior to those of the Commons. Conservatives, by contrast, declared that until the promised reform of the House of Lords had been completed, its pre-1911 right of veto devolved upon the sovereign. The most strident advocate of that dubious constitutional doctrine was Andrew Bonar Law, the Glasgow industrialist who, in the autumn of 1911, had succeeded a weary and irresolute Arthur Balfour as leader of the Unionists. Dining at Buckingham Palace in May 1912, he addressed his host and sovereign with unamiable credulity. I, sir, think that the situation is a grave one, not only for the House, but also for the throne. Our desire has been to keep the crown out of our struggles, but the government have brought it in. Your only chance is that they should resign within 2 years. If they don't, you must either accept the Home Rule Bill or dismiss your ministers and choose others who will support you in vetoing it. And in either case, half your subjects will think you have acted against them. The king turned red at those blunt words, and Bonar Law asked, "Have you never considered that, sir?" The king replied, "No, it is the first time it has been suggested to me." Law continued, "They may say that your assent is a purely formal act, and the prerogative veto is dead. That was true as long as there was a buffer between you and the House of Commons. But they have destroyed that buffer, and it is true no longer." Describing the conversation to a colleague, Bonar Law said, "I think I have given the king the worst 5 minutes that he has had for a long time." That attempt to use the king as an instrument of Unionist ambition must be accounted as one of the most unscrupulous of modern politics. Even those followers of Bonar Law, who did not share his detestation of home rule, were willing enough to see the government exposed to an untimely general election and the prospect of defeat at the polls. That such a maneuver would involve the king in either dismissing ministers who commanded a majority in the Commons or exercising the long dormant prerogative of veto weighed little with the party that professed a near monopoly of patriotism. As Esther put it, those who hate home rule sufficiently should be ready to risk their skins, but they should not skulk behind the throne. Okay. The king was not in principle opposed to home rule. In any case, his personal opinion on such a political issue was irrelevant to his constitutional duty. What caused him literally sleepless nights was the predicament so artfully laid bare by Bonar Law. He confided his anxieties to a handwritten memorandum that was hitherto remained unpublished. It includes this poignant passage. In May 1914, the bill will automatically come before me for my assent. I shall then be face to face with a serious dilemma. If I assent, half the people of this country will rightly or wrongly consider that I have not been faithful to my trust, while the people of Ulster will declare that I have deserted them. On the other hand, if I withhold my assent, my government would resign. The other half of the people would condemn my actions, and the whole of Ireland, except Ulster, would be indignant against me. In either case, I should not be able to put my foot in Ireland again. It's a position of affairs which would be intolerable, and one which no sovereign has ever been exposed. That really was a very poignant. Some members of the government, the king discovered, were as coldly unsympathetic as their Unionist counterparts. When at Balmoral, he complained to Lewis Harcourt that if he signed the Home Rule Bill, he will be hissed in the streets of Belfast. The minister in attendance replied that if he didn't sign the bill, he'd be hissed in the streets of London. "Damned impertinent," was the king's comment of his outspoken guest. Harcourt incurred more disfavor, and 2 months later on, in a public speech at Bradford, he warned that any unconstitutional action on the king's part would reduce the throne to a hopeless ruin which no one would attempt to rebuild. Stamfordham reproved him for having, as a cabinet minister, entered upon such a delicate ground. "The terms in which you did so," he continued, "appeared to His Majesty somewhat trenchant and monitory. Other ministers were more understanding. Haldane, who had recently become Lord Chancellor after 5 energetic years at the War Office, wrote to his mother, "I have in these days come to greatly admire the king. He's shown himself to have far more of his father's qualities of tact and judgment than I supposed. He is being bombarded by the Tory extremists with all sorts of suggestions. He is to dismiss the government and appeal to the people, refuse assent to the Home Rule Bill, and other wild ideas that are thrust upon him. He remains quite calm and is sure of his constitutional position and of being a real service in seeking a way out." The most memorable solution that was pressed upon the king was that of Lord Rosebery. Looking at the Windsor collection of miniatures, he came to one of Oliver Cromwell and said to his host, "That is the man we want now. To cut off my head? No. To turn out the Parliament." Esther also evoked the shade of Cromwell. Although his counsel was as comfortless as Rosebery's, the king, he declared, may exert all the arts of interrogation and persuasion on his ministers, but having failed to deter them from their chosen course, he must accept their advice, however damaging to welfare of the state. Esher continued austerely, "In the last resort, the king has no option. If the constitutional doctrines of the ministerial responsibility mean anything at all, the king would have to sign his own death warrant. If it was presented to him for signature by a minister commanding a majority of Parliament, if there is any tampering with the fundamental principle, it's the end of the monarchy is in sight." The king could well have replied that the execution of the monarch, particularly if it were to become an established constitutional practice, might destroy the monarchy even more swiftly. As it was, he kept his head in every sense, striving to save Ireland from civil war, while simultaneously preserving his political impartiality. That's key right there to emphasize the issue that King George had just in holding the whole empire together. It was all starting to fracture. So, in the spring of 1913, as the Home Rule Bill began, the second of the 3 required parliamentary circuits, there was an important change in the royal household. Lord Knowles retired, leaving Lord Stamfordham as the sovereign's sole private secretary. It seemed a natural enough transition. Knowles was 76, 14 years Stamford senior, and he had agreed to remain at Buckingham Palace after King Edward's death only at the pressing invitation of the new sovereign. The court circular placed on record the king's gratitude to him for more than a half-century of devoted service. In private audience, Knowles received a more personal expression of thanks and a commemorative silver inkstand. Behind those civilities lay a less happy saga. The king wrote in his diary on the 13th of February, 1913, "Saw Francis and told him I feared my having 2 private secretaries was not satisfactory, and that there perhaps he might consider whether it was not the best for him to resign. He took it quite quietly and said that he had thought I was perfectly right. Very disagreeable for me to have to say this to such an old friend as Francis, but I am sure it was for the best. 3 days later, Knowles gave Asquith his own account of the parting. I think I ought to let you know that I am leaving the King's service, and that in fact I have practically left it. Quite between ourselves, my position had become almost an impossible one, and it was made worse by the strong divergence of opinions which existed between the King and his surroundings, not by the Queen, on one side, and myself on the other, and nearly every question of public nature. The gulf that had separated the two private secretaries since their struggle for the King's mind in November 1910 was largely political. Each cherished his master's interests, but Knowles was at heart a liberal, Stamfordham a Tory. Knowles believed that the throne could best be preserved by prudent submission to ministerial advice. Stamfordham feared that each successive erosion of the royal prerogative heralded the ultimate destruction of both the monarchy and a stable society. They were united only in the zeal with which they rebuked an unfortunate phrase in a minister's speech or a failure to inform the king of a departmental decision. On the deeper issues of policy, such as that of a contingent guarantee, they were poles apart. Stamfordham's sharpness of pen and tongue accentuated the clash of political creeds. He wrote on 15 November 1912, 2 years ago tomorrow, Asquith commenced his policy of intimidation and dragooning. He put a pistol to the king's head, and during that short time he treated the House of Lords and the House of Commons very much in the same manner. He's going to reap his own reward. Not even the Prime Minister himself was spared Stamfordham's admonishments. I received from him yesterday, Asquith complained in the same year, a letter which both in tone and substance is quite unexampled in my communications with the Crown. After a chance meeting at Buckingham Palace, Lord Lincolnshire wrote of Stamfordham, "He is a very strong Tory and does not hesitate to show his colors. He seems to me to be developing into a public danger. It is the mercy of God that Francis Knowles kept on, and when eventually Knowles retired, Hobhouse recorded its depressing effect on the cabinet. Everyone lamented the loss of Knowles and the influence of Stamfordham, whose wings the PM, the Prime Minister, earnestly desired should be clipped. Such was the impression that the most correct, cautious, and politically impartial private secretary of the 19th and 20th century left on the previous decade. Knowles, too, had his detractors. The Unionists saw him as an ally, perhaps even the agent of the Liberal Party. They treated him, he complained, with studied coldness. Balfour, once his friend, conceived so strong an antipathy to the man and his methods that by the autumn of 1911 he would no longer meet him socially. And of all politicians, Balfour was the least quarrelsome. The cause of the breach lay in the constitutional crisis of November 1910. Knowles, determined to avoid a conflict between the Crown and the Cabinet, had told the King that if Asquith were either dismissed or provoked into resigning, Balfour would decline to form an alternative government. The King had therefore felt obliged to submit to Asquith's demand for a secret pledge to create unlimited peers. That was Knowles' first alleged misrepresentation of Balfour. The second came 2 months later. The king continued to brood over whether or not he should have resisted Asquith's threats of resignation. In spite of Knowles' advice, he'd sent for Balfour. Accordingly, with the king's knowledge, Knowles asked Balfour at a private dinner in January if he would in fact have been prepared to form a government in November. Balfour replied that in the interests of his party, he might have been forced to take office, but that it would have been imprudent of the king to dismiss his ministers and send for the leader of the opposition. Knowles had the answer he was seeking. Retrospectively, it seemed to justify what he had told the king. It was, however, an answer extracted under false pretenses. In January 1911, Balfour believed that the issue between sovereign and prime minister 2 months earlier had been the king's reluctance to grant Asquith a dissolution of Parliament, and thus a general election, for the second time within a year. Knowles omitted to reveal that far more had been at stake. As Balfour wrote in August 1911, after the king's secret pledge in November 1910 had been made known, had I been asked to form a government in order to protect His Majesty from giving a promise, not merely that a parliamentary bill should be passed over the heads of the lords, but that it should be passed in a form which, by implication, carried home rule with it, I should not only have formed a government, but I should have had great hopes of carrying the country with me. In a further letter to stand for him, a week later, Balfour turned from his lost opportunity of thwarting Asquith to Knowles, with a want of candor on the night of their dinner. Do you think it's fair that I should be asked to discuss public affairs under circumstances which imply freedom and confidence? With an ambassador by whom I was deliberately kept in ignorance in the most essential features of the situation, both Lord Knowles and the Prime Minister were, from the very nature of the case, intimately acquainted with all that had taken place with regard to the pledges in November. I had not an inkling that in November anything of importance on this subject had been arranged between the king and his ministers. Lord Knowles seems therefore to have endeavored to extract from me a general statement of the policy to be used as the occasion arose, which studiously concealing the most important elements and the actual concrete problems that had to be solved. Knowles, to whom Stamfordham showed Balfour's letters, as it is author doubtless intended, had no possible defense against the imputation of deceit. With less justification, however, Balfour had alleged that Knowles had repeated their dinner table conversation to Asquith. A sinner accused of the wrong sin, Knowles reacted with outraged virtue. He stormed down to the House of Commons to confront Balfour, but found only his secretary, Sanders. I told him, Knowles wrote, that in the days of dueling I should have called Balfour out, that the whole thing was a lie, and I demanded an apology and a retraction from Balfour of the vile and calumnious charge he had brought against me. Balfour, a notoriously slothful correspondent, allowed 3 weeks to pass before sending a reply. It did not satisfy his assailant. We shall, for the future, Knowles wrote, meet as strangers. Although a formal reconciliation eventually took place, it failed to heal the breach. When Lady Desborough asked Balfour whom he would like as a fellow guest at a house party, he replied, "My dear Eddie, I should enjoy meeting any man in England, except Lord Knowles. Him I will not meet." Did the king know of these discords and their cause? Although it was not until the end of 1913, several months after Knowles had retired, that he learned of the misleading advice given to him in November 1910. He was almost certainly told of the quarrel between Knowles and Balfour soon after it occurred. Nor can he have been aware of the political differences which continued to fray the tempers of his two private secretaries and in turn add to his own burden. Both Knowles and Stamfordham were men of high personal honor. If one acted with too much discretion, the other was with too little. It was only in order to serve what they believed to be the best interest of the monarchy. Yet each had become a focus of political discontent within an institution dependent upon political impartiality. The uneasy partnership must be broken. Knowles accepted his retirement with good grace. He was, after all, in his 77th year and could not have been expected to retain his post indefinitely. The king took untold pains to soften the blow. He asked that Master of English Prose, Lord Rosebery, to compose a sympathetic announcement for the court circular. Anxiously inquired a few days later whether Knowles harbored any bitterness, wrote him this letter of heartfelt consolation. My dear Francis, I wish to send you these few lines, as I could not tell you all I felt when I saw you this morning. I have known you ever since I can remember anyone or anything. You are my oldest friend, and the one whose advice I have so often sought, and never in vain. When you were with my dear father, you never failed to give me help and assistance, however I asked. Your 47 years with my father was one long, faithful service and devotion, and no one knows better than I do the trust and the reliance he placed in you, and how much it was justified. Since you have been with me, I never forget that you remained on with me because I asked you to do so for a time, when perhaps the shock to you of my dear father's death may have made you wish to retire. You have done all that you could to help me with your knowledge and experience. I am very grateful to you. My dear Francis, I am grateful for your lifelong help and for the advice and assistance you have always been ready to give, and for the support on which I relied on. It is a real pain to part with a friend, and I can assure you that I felt it most keenly today, especially when the friend is one's oldest. But I hope the parting is only in an official sense, and that the friendship which has lasted so long between us may continue till the end. I remain, my dear Francis, your very affectionate and grateful old friend, George R.I. Knowles' retirement barely disturbed the rhythm of the king's well-ordered life. Stamfordham took charge of all the important duties, and many that were not. The rest were distributed between the two assistant private secretaries, Lieutenant Colonel Sir Frederick Ponsonby and Major Clive Wigram. The Prime Minister, smart from the loss of Knowles, told Stamfordham how much he wished that the king would include an able civilian among his secretaries. Instead of always drawing them from more or less, mostly less, instructed soldiers. Esquist, he had a jibe that was unfair to all three. Wigram, like Stamfordham, had been commissioned into the Royal Artillery, later transferring to the Indian Cavalry. As aide-de-camp to Lord Curzon, he had caught the eye of Sir Walter Lawrence, who recruited him to help organize the King's first Indian tour as Prince of Wales. The King, in turn, appointed him as a part-time equerry, and in 1910 invited him to join the permanent household as an assistant private secretary. Although approaching 40, Wigram embarked on his new career with humility. Finding his lack of language as a handicap, he gave his lunch hour to have French lessons. His English was vigorous but idiosyncratic. Having been an outstanding games player at Winchester College, he acquired a lifelong habit of peppering even his official correspondence with sporting metaphors. Thus, he would write to a proconsul, "The king never had such a good set of ministers, and it is wonderful how we can put a strong team into the field whenever required. Even our second 11 would defeat most other countries." When Stamfordham was ill for a few weeks in 1912, Wigram more than held his own. "He has done quite splendidly," the king noted. "Never made a mistake and is simply a glutton for work. Besides being a charming fellow, I am indeed lucky to have found a man like him." Stamfordham, too, though I think highly of him, writing to Wigram's mother in the same year, his natural power of looking ahead, his accurate mind and common sense, his charming and patient temper, his untiring energy and industry have enabled him to achieve successfully what would have baffled not one man but several. Sir Frederick Ponsonby saw fewer virtues in his fellow private secretary. He told Lord Hardinge, "He's a very nice fellow, and he's very hard-working and businesslike, but his horizon is limited, and he does not seem to be able to take a broad-minded view of the many perplexing questions that come here. He has the true British contempt for all foreigners, which is now rather out of date, and his political views are those of the ordinary officer at Aldershot. The cool assessment of a colleague throws as much light on its author as it does on Wigram." Fritz Ponsonby, a son of Queen Victoria's private secretary, had been at court since 1895. He shared his father's reverence for the institution of the monarchy, but he lacked both the tact and the adroitness in which Sir Henry overcame the foibles of an obstinate old lady. The Ponsonby family, it must be admitted, was censorious by nature. Queen Victoria once felt obliged to call on Lady Ponsonby with a request that she should tell her husband not to say, "It is absurd," when the Queen made a remark. Lady Ponsonby, too, could be sharp of tongue, and when she referred to a lady-in-waiting as foolishly cringing to all the little miseries of etiquette, their son inherited the same independence of mind, but also displayed an obstinacy which could cause resentment. At the very outset of his career at court, he unwittingly caused deep offense to the Queen. One reason why he had appointed him an equerry was to please his father. Another was in the hope that his months as aide-de-camp to Lord Elgin Curzon's predecessor as viceroy, would have equipped him to manage her Indian attendants. The Queen's favorite among him was Abdul Karim, who she made her first munshi, or teacher, then her Indian secretary. The rest of her household deplored the promotion, partly from racial prejudice, partly from genuinely held belief that the munshi was in correspondence with Indian dissidents. They took their revenge by disparaging his social origins. The Queen thereupon telegraphed to Fritz Ponsonby, who was about to leave India on appointment as her equerry, instructing him to call on the munshi's father, supposedly a medical practitioner or even a surgeon general of the Indian Army. On obeying her command, Ponsonby found that the man was neither. He was but an apothecary of the jail in Agra. The Queen was displeased by the report and told Ponsonby that he must have seen the wrong person. Instead of conceding so sensitive a point, he insisted that he was right. Through the whole of his first year at court, the Queen barely spoke to him, and not once did she ask him to dine. As for the irrepressible munshi, his pride was soothed by the Queen's insistence that he should become a companion of the Order of the Indian Empire. Even when taken back into royal favor, Ponsonby sinned again by getting married, albeit after waiting 3 years to suit the Queen's convenience. Like Lord Kirshner, she feared that no wife could keep a husband's secrets. Ponsonby endured occasional storms during his 9 years as assistant private secretary to Edward VII, but he always survived. The king appreciated his eye for correct ceremonial, his cosmopolitan outlook, his easy command of French. Unlike his father, who once shocked the king by appearing at a dinner with 2 identical Jubilee medals on his chest, Fritz won his sovereign's respect with a prejudiced knowledge of orders and decorations. In the course of the reign, he personally received almost a score of them. It was equally characteristic of Ponsonby to teach himself shorthand so that he could conduct the king's business with more dispatch. On the accession of King George V, Ponsonby continued in the role of assistant private secretary, the repository of court custom and etiquette. His skill as a raconteur and his nose for fine claret ensured a convivial social life. It was a strain, however, to support a wife and 2 children on little more than £1,000 a year. In 1912, he had hopes of being appointed governor of Bombay, but when Asquith learned that the king would not welcome Ponsonby's departure, the tentative offer was withdrawn. His thoughts often turned to ways of increasing his income, some of them improbable, like writing film scripts, for instance, or planning to recover King John's treasure from the Welsh. The kings never like opposition or remonstrance, Escher used to say, even the best of them. Ponsonby recognized that truth, but did not allow it to interfere with a lifelong habit of outspokenness. In later years, he wrote, King George V hated all insincerity and flattery, but after a time he got so accustomed to people agreeing with him that he resented the candid friend business. At one time he took a dislike to me, as he thought I invariably disagreed with any views he happened to express. But after a time he regarded me as an unavoidable critic. There is a contemporary evidence to support that somewhat ungracious confession. During the first years of the reign, the king used often to play royal or indoor tennis with members of his household. Here's an account of one such contest in 1913, written by Ponsonby to his wife. We played tennis. The king, Derek Keppel, Harry Verney, and me, and a pretty rotten game we had. It appears that Wigram and Willie Cadogan were accustomed to send easy ones over to the king. So when we played the usual game, the king skulked and refused to try after the first set. He told us we didn't understand the game and we ought to send easy ones. I was furious, as Pat Ball is such rot, so I proceeded to exaggerate this and lop slow, easy ones in a babyish way over the net. This annoyed the king, who saw how absurd it must look, and we had an altercation at the net. After some heat, the king said, "All right, play any way you like." So I then proceeded to smash them at him, and he sulked and wouldn't move. Then an awkward pause after Derek and I won 2 sets. Then I asked him to try my way of cutting down properly and proposed that he and I should play Harry Verney and Derek and give them 15. I really knew we could give them only 30. So we started and had a capital game, the king cutting them down beautifully. They never had a look in, as we were very much the best. HM made some really beautiful strokes, and it was a different kind of game, so all ended up happily, but he meanwhile to tell Wigram he must not kowtow to the king in this way. A middle-aged monarch seeking relaxation from the problems of home rule might have wished so insolent a tutor elsewhere. And Sir Charles Cust, he already had one candid courtier. 2 could be depressing. The king nevertheless saw beyond Ponsonby's provocative qualities, promoted him to Keeper of the Privy Purse and Treasure. He heaped him with honors. Created Lord Sinsby in June 1935, he died in the king's service. The retirement of Knowles on March 13th left Stamfordham and the king's closest confidant and principal channel of communications with the government. It was not, however, until August of that year, a month after the Home Rule Bill had for the second time been approved by the Commons and rejected by the Lords, that his power in persuasion and draftsmanship were put to the test. Throughout the summer, men of all parties and none had burdened an increasingly worried sovereign with their views on home rule. The Prime Minister alone, trusting in his impregnable parliamentary majority, remained supine and silent. On 11 August, he was summoned an audience at Buckingham Palace. He cannot have much enjoyed it. In replying to the king's complaint that the Prime Minister had not mentioned the Irish problem to him for several months, Asquith said that he had not felt it was proper for him to ask for an audience, that he now welcomed an opportunity of discussing Home Rule, that he had served 3 sovereigns, 2 of them as Prime Minister, and wished to take the king entirely into his confidence. When the king expressed concern at the role which he himself might be called upon to play, Asquith reminded him that the sovereign was unassailable as long as he continued to act only on the advice of his ministers, and he refrained from exercising a veto that had lain dormant since the reign of Queen Anne. Should the king think that the actions of his ministers were detrimental to the country or to the throne? Asquith continued, it was his duty to warn them in the writing of his misgivings. At that moment, perhaps to Asquith's surprise, the king handed him a long memorandum on home rule. A few days earlier, he had interpreted a sailing holiday at Cowes to confer with Stamfordham aboard the royal yacht Victoria and Albert. Between them, they had composed a formidable document, reproachful yet constructive. It reminded the Prime Minister of the rising tide of rebellion in Ulster. And of the pressures on the sovereign to avert civil war by some personal initiative, of the likelihood that whatever he did would alienate half of his Irish subjects. I cannot help feeling, the king wrote, that the government is drifting and taking me with it. He therefore suggested a conference between all the parties to consider such possible solutions as the exclusion of Ulster from the Home Rule Bill and the extension of devolution to other parts of the United Kingdom. The Prime Minister promised to prepare a detailed reply to all those points. On the following day, the king went north to shoot grouse. Asquith was disturbed by the king's initiative. He wrote to Churchill, the minister in attendance at Balmoral, you probably find yourself in a rather fuliginous atmosphere. Between ourselves, I have already sent the first part, and tomorrow our next day hope is to send the second, of a memorandum in which I've drawn up for the royal eye on the whole situation. Balmoral turned out to be less oppressive than the Prime Minister had supposed. The king, and Churchill reported, was extremely cordial and intimate, and Stamfordham, freed from the irritant of Knowles's contrary influence, was friendly and moderate. It was with a stiffening resolve, however, that the sovereign and private secretary read Asquith's promised apologia on home rule. The first part of the document, which dealt with the constitutional issues, reflected the Prime Minister's mind at its most pellucid. We have now a well-established tradition of 200 years that, in the last resort, the occupant of the throne accepts and acts upon the advice of its ministers. The sovereign may have lost something of his personal power and authority, but the crown has thereby been removed from the storms and vicissitudes of party politics. Its impersonal status is an invaluable safeguard for the continuity of our national life. The Parliament Act, Asquith continued, was not intended to affect, nor had it affected, the constitutional role of the sovereign. It concerned only the relations between the two houses of Parliament. If the king refused to give his assent to one bill, he would be expected to refuse it on others. Every act of Parliament of the first order of importance, and only passed after acute controversy, would be regarded as bearing the personal imprimatur of the sovereign. The crown would become the football of contending factions. The forceful phrased essay was worthy to be passed into the notebook of Bagehot, which the king had compiled 20 years earlier. Yet it did nothing to allay his anxiety. Was he expected to shelter behind the Prime Minister's polished prose while his Irish subjects tore themselves to pieces? To that question, too, Ashford offered a supposedly reassuring answer in the second part of his memorandum. When the Home Rule Bill became law, he explained, there was the certainty of tumult and riot, and more than the possibility of bloodshed. But to call it a civil war would be a misuse of terms. If, however, the bill failed to become a law, it is not too much to say that Ireland would become ungovernable, nor would the Prime Minister agree to a general election in order to test public opinion. Such a course would thwart the purpose of the Parliament Act, yet achieve no practical result in the pacification of Ireland. Finally, although not opposed to some compromise on Home Rule, Asquith saw little hope of a settlement by negotiation as long as the antagonists were separated by an unbridgeable chasm of principle. The king was not a man to share the prime minister's complacent immobility. In a letter of more than 2,000 words, he subjected Asquith's memorandum to an exegesis that not even his grandmother could have improved upon. Rightly or wrongly, he protested his people would associate him with the policy adopted by his advisers. He repeated his conviction that the virtual emasculation of the House of Lords had cast an additional burden of responsibility on the sovereign. He asked whether there was any precedent for not submitting to the elaborate bill opposed by practically the whole of the House of Lords, by 1/3 of the House of Commons, by half the population of England. A bill, moreover, forced through the House of Commons, pages of it never had been discussed. Turning to the Prime Minister's almost forecast perspective of tumult and bloodshed, the king came to the heart of the matter. Do you propose to employ the army to suppress such disorders? This is, to my mind, one of the most serious questions which the government will have to decide. In doing so, you will, I am sure, bear in mind that ours is a voluntary army. Our soldiers are nonetheless citizens. By birth, religion, and environment, they may have strong feelings on the Irish question. Will it be wise, will it be fair to the sovereign as head of the army to subject the discipline and indeed the loyalty of his troops to such a strain? The king ended his letter in a less contentious note. I rejoice to know that you are ready and anxious to enter into a conference if a definite basis can be found upon which to confer. For my part, I will gladly do everything in my power to induce the opposition to meet you in a reasonable and conciliatory spirit. For it behoves us all to withhold no efforts to avert those threatening events which would inevitably outrage humanity and lower the British name in the mind of the whole civilized world. As the Prime Minister was shortly to be the king's guest at Balmoral, Asquith replied that the formidable letter with brevity and restraint. He could not resist a flash of resentment on the use of the army. There is, in my opinion, no sufficient grounds for the fears or hopes expressed in some quarters that the troops would fail to do their duty. Like much else in the king's admonition, Asquith thought that the royal view hardly distinguishable from a manifesto of Unionist policy, the Prime Minister's newfound willingness to seek a compromise on Home Rule nevertheless sprang directly from the King's initiative. Once at Balmoral, Asquith was exposed to further royal argument, and it was from there that he wrote to Bonar Law on 8 October, suggesting that they should hold informal and secret talks as a first step towards a possible avoidance of danger to the state. Prime Minister and leader of the opposition met on 14 October. Then, at intervals during the next 3 months, Asquith proposed that Ulster should accept Home Rule in principle, but be entitled to veto any act of the new Irish Parliament which infringed upon her autonomy. Bonar Law replied with a demand for Ulster's total exclusion from Home Rule for an indefinite period. Each side rejected the contention of the other out of hand. Throughout the negotiation, Bonar Law, no less than Asquith, was subjected to palace pressure. Stamfordham, he wrote to Bonar Law, His Majesty still clings to the belief in British common sense, and trusts that, by give and take, by all parties concerned, an amicable solution may yet to be found. Bonar's Law reply was discouraging. I'm sorry to say that I do not share the hopeful view your letter expresses. I now despair of any agreement between the parties, in our belief that there are now only two courses open to the government. They must either submit their bill to the judgment of the people or prepare to face the consequences of civil war. Brazenly attempting to extract a political advantage from his own intransigence, he went on to suggest that the king should write to his ministers, telling them it was their duty to hold a general election before Home Rule becomes a law. Of course, the king had imprudently mentioned to the leader of the opposition a few months earlier. Stamfordham reacted frostily to Bonar's Law and his impertinence. As to any special communication to his ministers, His Majesty's actions will be guided by time and circumstance. The king had not abandoned his desire to see Home Rule put to the test of a general election, even if that required a hazardous measure as the dismissal of government or the withholding of the royal assent. Yet in his heart of hearts, he was unwilling to change his advisers, least of all the prompting of Bonar Law. He admitted to Esher that he liked Asquith, with whom he was upon the frankest and most friendly of terms. For the dour and abrasive leader of the opposition, he felt no regard. The king was even more reluctant to see the departure of Sir Edward Grey from the Foreign Office, considering him to be the most respected figure in the European's diplomatic world, and he was impossible to replace. I'm going to end here because there are several more pages to read, and I will do this in a two-part. And that just finalizes the decisions that are made and the complications that were brewing under King George's reign, and the ideas of Home Rule, Irish Home Rule. It was a very complicated matter, and he was influenced by different viewpoints of prime ministers and politicians. So I'll pick this up in another section. It'll be brief, but much better, and it'll close out everything regarding Home Rule.